Shalom, and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. This is a recording of a Shabbat sermon with Rabbi Adam Kligfeld.
Since I was a young child, I've always loved Hallel. We were a family that went to shul on Yontif, even weekdays. And I loved and learned to sing all of the parts of Hallel, and I love leading Hallel to this day. It's a short, compact musical service that you say on special days, and it always packed a punch for me, even kind of before I spoke the language of an adult religious person. And the part of Hallel that I love singing the most is the one that usually is the part of Hallel that has the most number of people in the room singing simultaneously. It begins, Adonai Zecharanu Yevarech, Yevarech et Beit Yisrael. It's a good one, right? If you've ever been in the room with me when we've been davening Hallel, you may or may not have noticed that when we get to the part that says, Yosef Adonai Aleichem, I do this. Yosef Adonai Aleichem. Every single time. And it's also a little shtick between me and my children. When we get close to Yosef, we look at each other and we do a little fist pump. I'll get back to that later. But I want to tell you a story. In my family, the tradition has always been that if possible, before Yamin Norim, before Rosh Hashanah, you pay respects to Kever Avot. You go to the cemetery or cemeteries where members of your family are buried, and you connect with the previous generations. And I used to like going, it was important to me to go with my mother in particular, and her sister to visit their grandparents in Poughkeepsie. I would occasionally go with my grandfather to visit his parents in the cemeteries they were buried in Queens. And then when my grandparents began to die, it became a significant ritual for me. And I will never forget my first visit to my grandfather's grave after my oldest child was born, after Noah was born. So this would have been a few weeks before Rosh Hashanah in 2002. He's buried in a cemetery in Westchester called Sharon Gardens. It's a beautiful cemetery. And I was coming from New York, where I was living, and my mother and her sister were coming from Connecticut, and we were going to be arriving at around the same time. And I got there first. And I had my 10 or 11-month-old daughter, Noah, with me. And since we got there first, and I was just waiting for them, it happened to be a beautiful summer day. There's a lovely tree about 30 feet away from where my grandfather was buried. And I took her out of the car, and she sat down in the grass, and she was just playing in a pretty place for a few minutes until my mother and aunt came. I saw my mother and aunt driving up. I said, now it's time to pick up Noah and bring her over to the grave. And as I walked her over to the grave and saw my grandfather's name on the stone, I literally collapsed. I almost crushed her because I had no idea that my knees were going to buckle and that I was going to lose my composure. There was something about seeing his name on the stone, holding his descendant, whom he would have loved to play with and loved to love, was overwhelming for me. As if the name made him more gone than he had been. As if seeing Joseph Engelman on the stone made him more dead than he had ever been. I was thinking about that last week. I was booking a flight for one of my children, and I was in my account on Delta. And because I book flights for them all the time, because they've been living on the East Coast for a while, they're saved, passengers in my account. And as I typed in which passenger I was buying a ticket for, the website naturally produced what had been from the past the emergency contact for my daughter, which is Carol Kligfeld, my mother who passed away 4.5 weeks ago. And here I was in a mundane moment on the internet, booking a flight, hoping that the miles wouldn't be so much. And I was shown without warning my mother's name, almost like a window into what was, and a very, very painful reminder as to what no longer is, as to who no longer is. There was something about seeing her name on a screen representing a person who's no longer alive that deepened my grief for a few moments. I had been in that mode that the names of those who have passed pulls us into the truth of their loss, until I came upon a reading, a beautiful interpretation, in the opening lines of Parshat Shmot, Parsha which we've already learned with such depth thanks to Finley's Dvar Torah. The book of Shmot and the Parsha of Shmot begins with a rather anodyne verse, Ve'elu Shmot B'nai Yisrael. These are the names of the children of Israel who came down to Egypt with Jacob. And the next few verses list the names that we know quite well, Reuven and Shimon and Levi, etc. It's just the beginning of really a narrative of our going into slavery, but we never read the verses of the Torah as just anything. There's always something inside the specificity of the words that's supposed to bring us to a new insight. And every single commentator that you can look at that tries to say something on the opening lines of Shmot asks the same question. Why do we need to be told their names? We know their names. We read Breshit. We know Jacob's sons. It's just last week that we were seeing them being blessed by Jacob. What is the significance, particularly in a text that is committed to not being redundant and not adding anything extraneous, for us to be told, again, to waste verses on the fact that these are the names of the children of Israel who came down to Egypt? What, do you think we forgot? Rashi says this is Lahodia Chibatan, in order to reinforce to you how much affection God has for the names of the children of Israel. Or perhaps how much affection Yaakov had for the names of that he gave his children. In order to say, it's not redundancy, it's love. When someone's your beloved, you love saying their name. And you love when they say your name. It's never extraneous to say the name of a person. That's lovely. But then I found another commentary which is really living with me. It's from the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Chassidut. Now, caveat, whenever you're quoting the Baal Shem Tov, you have no idea if you're actually quoting the Baal Shem Tov. He didn't write a book. He just spent years and decades teaching his Chassidim before the concept of Chassidim existed. And his teachings were written down by his students, and we don't know how long after he gave them the written down. He was often speaking on Shabbos when they weren't writing it down. But there are collections that are attributed to the Baal Shem Tov, and this teaching is attributed to the Baal Shem Tov. And what the Baal Shem Tov says about that verse and that question is this. There is a parallel between what happens in the physical world and what happens in the spiritual world. In the physical world, when you put your hand on someone, when you grab them, when you touch them, you're going to wake them up on some level. You're going to make it clear that you want their attention and they're going to be present, right? It's very hard to ignore someone slapping you on the shoulder, grabbing your arm, tugging at a part of your clothing. That gets your attention. You are there, you are present, and you are aware. He says something similar is happening on the spiritual realm, but it doesn't happen with physical touch. It happens through a much more thin and tender action, and that is saying someone's name. When you say someone's name, the Baal Shem Tov wants to believe, you are awakening them, bringing them to that moment, even if and this part you have to lean into if you want to get inside his teaching, even when they are gone. The fact that when you are sleeping and someone says your name, you wake instantly is a microcosm, he says, of the reality that when you mention the name of someone who's not present because they're not in your physical area, or mention the name of someone who's not present because they have left this world, on a spiritual level, you are beckoning them back. They are alive. The connection is real. You have an opportunity to reach beyond this realm. What he's saying is operating on several levels. In the verse, he's saying that the Torah mentions the names of the children of Israel, even though we know them, to kind of wake them up from their slumber retroactively and say, Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yisachar, Naphtali, you're about to enter into something very difficult. Egypt, which is going to become slavery. Your descendants are going to suffer. By mentioning your names, I wake up the souls and the spirits of the children of Israel to give them the mettle that they're going to need to endure those years of slavery. And he would also say that that's why the Torah mentions it. But when we read the Torah, as we did this morning, as Finley did this morning, we are retroactively, if you can lean into this idea, having an impact on our ancestors' experience in Egypt as slaves, because when we say Reuven, Reuven is alive. We say Yisachar, Yisachar is alive. When we mention them, they come back to a place of life that may not seem obvious. And it goes one step further. Who in the generation in which the Baal Shem Tov lived is more alive than the Baal Shem Tov? Why? Because we mention his name, we study his works, and everyone who lived contemporaneously with him has mostly been forgotten. But the Baal Shem Tov is on the lips of almost any Jew who knows anything about the spiritual tradition. How could we possibly say anything other than that he lives in some significant way? My grandfather's name was Joseph. His Hebrew name was Yosef. He used to come to visit us on Chagim. He wasn't much of a shul goer himself, but when he came to visit us in Connecticut, he would come to shul. And he would sit with us in Hallel. And when it got to Yosef Adonai Alechem, he would hear his name and he would lift his fist, kind of like John Carlos, the 1968 Olympics, if you get the reference. And it was delightful. And my grandpa wasn't a davener. He didn't really know what the words meant. But he heard the name of his biblical progenitor and he delighted in it. And he liked hearing his name in prayers. And now 26 years after he breathed his last, I do believe on some level, particularly through the prism of the teaching of the Baal Shem Tov, that every time I sing Hallel, and every time I look at my children, and there's a twinkle in our eyes, and we raise our fists, and we say, Yosef Adonai Alechem, that Yosef is more alive than he was before. That my grandfather somehow died and lives. That there is loss that can feel permanent and then can be reversed when you say their name, when you bring them into the room, when you beckon them back to life. So say their names and speak of them generously and often. And Grandpa, you're still with me. And Ima, you're still alive in my heart. And I will say your names for as long as I live.
You've been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast website or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information on Temple Beth Am, Los Angeles, please visit www.tbala.org.